field. They were experiencing a lot of health symptoms, which made us look at trying to sample back behind there. The issues with some of the air monitoring by both myself and some of the air monitoring done by CTEC and some of the independents was it was very windy, and that was something that we talked about together, was the conditions to sample in those first few days with the rain and the wind and a lot of the weather we were having was not ideal. These were the chemicals detected in sample 1. Benzene, toluene, hexane, cyclohexane, heptane, and octane exceeded some screening levels. Benzene was actually exceeded the Texas TCEQ long-term health effect screening and the Louisiana ambient air standard. Hexane exceeded the Texas short-term health effect screening level. Cyclohexane exceeded the Texas TCEQ long-term health effect screening level. And then heptane and octane also exceed that. Something that's really important to know is that you're going to hear a lot of talk about what's safe, like what levels are safe. How do we know how it's going to affect us as community members who live in these areas 24 hours a day, 7 days a week? We work there, our kids play there. There is no safe level for benzene. There is no safe level for being exposed to that short or long term. You're being put at a risk. Something I want to make sure I'm clear about between the difference between the tools we use, which is canister sampling, and then the tools that sometimes is used by some state-by-state agencies and then other independent agencies, is there's a difference in what the equipment can detect. So monitoring in part per billion is the best way to identify short and long-term exposures to vulnerable populations. Women, children, elderly, those with pre-existing conditions. In our opinion, the industry monitoring is not appropriate in identifying the risk to these populations and community exposures because they historically are known to use part per million detection limits. Part per million detection limits are best applied to occupational standards, so healthy men who are working on site 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. It's not appropriate to take part per million sampling and when you're not detecting certain chemicals in the air to say that general populations are not likely to have health effects. You have to look for these chemicals in those low detections, otherwise you're not going to find them, and I think that it's misleading to tell the public that you're not picking up chemicals that you're testing for in part per million, when if you were to test in part per billion, you will probably find them in lower detection. A good example is 5 part per billion detection in benzene over a 14-day period can result in long-term health effects according to long-term exposure limits. Monitors at occupational, CTEC monitors at occupational standards, a level above the recommended detection setting to address community exposure. Some of the air monitors go over that. So what does this mean? What does those 30 chemicals that I just showed you and some of those that did go over some of those standards mean? We consulted with Dr. Neil Harmon, who is a one-star Sierra Club and former Texas Commission on Environmental Quality Inspector. He quotes that each of the 30 hydrocarbons measured in the Mayflower release is a toxic chemical on its own and may pose a threat to health depending on various exposure and individual factors. I go on to kind of list some of those long-term and short-term health effects. You can find a few copies of that over on the table. And then we did give a list of recommendations. We met with Exxon one day with Doma Super, who was one of the experts that attended our first town hall meeting, and we tried to relay to them how important it was to take the community that had been affected to put some public service announcements out there and to try to put together a centralized, local clinic where you bring in some occupational and environmental medical specialists, doctors who specialize in these types of toxins and how they can interact with the community. Our answers that we got were not something that was ideal. It was basically tell people to call the claims hotline and we will address any and all valid claims. We felt that wasn't appropriate. I'm going to be really frank about that. We felt like there was a lot more that could be done in those first few days to try to educate and inform mothers especially even on the interstate, who were driving through that were being exposed to some of these odors and toxins. I also brought a copy, and I think everyone got one, of the Wellness Savers report. We used her as an expert to go through this data, to also look at some of the data that's been posted on the ADHD website. So you can kind of go through there and look at some of these health effects. A lot of the sampling being done by industry was coming in part per million. And just, you know, part per million and part per billion. Part per million is just 1,000 times. There's 1,000 times difference between the two. So if you were to picture an adult and a small child, part per million sampling, you're looking at the head, at the top of the head of the adult. Part per billion sampling, you're looking